David Chen had always been the type of person who arrived at airports 3 hours early. But today was different. Today, everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. His alarm clock had failed to ring at 5 in the morning. The coffee maker had decided to break down just when he needed his usual caffeine boost. Then his rideshare driver had taken what seemed like the longest possible route to Denver International Airport, hitting every single red light along the way. David sat in the back seat, checking his phone for the 100th time. His flight to Seattle was scheduled to depart in exactly 90 minutes. Normally, this would be plenty of time. But as he watched the traffic crawl forward at a snail's pace, he felt his stomach tighten with worry. This wasn't just any ordinary business trip. Tomorrow morning, he would be standing in front of 12 potential investors presenting his startup idea that had consumed every waking moment of the past 2 years. The presentation had to be perfect. Everything depended on it. His small tech company specialized in creating accessibility software for people with disabilities. It was personal for David. He had been living with type 1 diabetes since he was 8 years old, and he understood firsthand how technology could either help or hinder people with medical conditions. The app he had developed could predict blood sugar crashes hours before they happened, potentially saving thousands of lives. But developing it had drained his savings account. This meeting in Seattle represented his last chance to secure the funding needed to bring his vision to life. As the rideshare finally pulled up to the departure terminal, David grabbed his black messenger bag and laptop case. He had packed light for this trip, bringing only the essentials: his presentation materials, his laptop, a change of clothes, and of course, his medical supplies. The automatic doors of the airport whooshed open, and David was immediately hit by the familiar chaos of a busy travel hub. Families dragged oversized suitcases while children ran between their legs. Business travelers clutched coffee cups and spoke loudly into their phones. The departure boards flickered constantly with gate changes and delay announcements. David quickened his pace toward the security checkpoint. He had TSA pre-check, which usually made this process smooth and fast. He pulled out his boarding pass and ID, joining what he hoped would be the shorter line. But as he approached the rope barriers, his heart sank. The pre-check line stretched much longer than usual. A sign posted near the entrance explained that 2 of the X-ray machines were temporarily out of service due to technical difficulties. All pre-check passengers were being funneled through a single scanner. David checked his phone again. 75 minutes until departure. He tried to calm himself by reviewing his presentation notes on his phone. The key statistics, the market research, the projected revenue streams. He knew this material inside and out, but nerves were making him second-guess everything. The line moved slowly, very slowly. David watched as families ahead of him struggled to remove shoes and unpack laptops. An elderly gentleman in front of him seemed confused by the liquid restrictions and was arguing with a TSA agent about his large bottle of shampoo. 55 minutes until departure. David felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Despite the airport's aggressive air conditioning, he practiced deep breathing exercises that his doctor had taught him to manage stress-related blood sugar spikes. Stress was one of the worst triggers for his diabetes, and he needed to stay calm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David reached the document checker. The TSA agent glanced at his ID and boarding pass with practiced efficiency and waved him through. David gathered his belongings and approached the metal detector. This was usually the easy part. David had been through airport security hundreds of times over the years. His insulin pump occasionally caused minor delays, but the TSA agents were generally understanding once he explained the medical necessity of the device. He emptied his pockets completely, placing his wallet, phone, and keys into the plastic bin. His laptop went into a separate bin along with his shoes and belt. The small insulin pump attached to his abdomen was discreet enough that it rarely drew attention during the initial screening. The TSA agent manning the metal detector looked tired and stressed. The equipment malfunctions had clearly made this a difficult day for everyone working security. David sympathized with the challenges these workers faced, dealing with impatient travelers and technical problems beyond their control. "Step forward," the agent instructed. David walked through the metal detector, expecting the usual silence that indicated a successful pass. Instead, a loud, persistent beeping filled the air. He looked back at the agent with surprise. This had never happened before with his insulin pump. The device was specifically designed to be travel-friendly, and David had all the proper medical documentation in his bag. "Step back and try again," the agent said, sounding slightly irritated. David walked back through the detector and tried again. Once more, the machine erupted in angry beeps. Other passengers in line behind him began shifting impatiently. He could hear someone mutter something about people not knowing how to empty their pockets properly. The TSA agent's expression grew more serious. "Sir, please step aside for additional screening." David felt his face begin to flush. Additional screening meant delay, and delay meant potentially missing his flight. More importantly, it meant drawing unwanted attention from the growing crowd of travelers waiting behind him. "I have a medical device," David explained quickly, pulling out his medical card from his wallet. "It's an insulin pump for diabetes. I have all the documentation." The agent barely glanced at the card. "Sir, please step aside and wait for a supervisor." As David moved to the designated screening area, he caught sight of the departure board. His gate was now showing boarding in bright red letters. 40 minutes until takeoff, and he wasn't even through security yet. Behind him, the line of travelers was growing longer and more restless. He could feel dozens of eyes watching him, some with curiosity, others with obvious annoyance. This was exactly the kind of attention David had always tried to avoid. His hands were shaking slightly now, a combination of stress and the need to check his blood sugar levels. But his testing supplies were in his carry-on bag, which was still sitting on the other side of the security checkpoint. The supervisor would arrive soon, David told himself. This would all be resolved quickly, and he would make his flight with time to spare. Tomorrow's presentation would go perfectly, and this minor inconvenience would become just another travel story to share with friends. He had no idea that the next few minutes would change not just his travel plans, but the course of his entire life. The supervisor who approached David looked like he had been dealing with difficult situations all morning. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, and there was a coffee stain on his badge. The name tag read Williams, and his expression suggested that David's medical device was just another complication in an already challenging day. "What seems to be the problem here?" Supervisor Williams asked the screening agent. "Metal detector keeps going off. He says he has some kind of medical device, but I can't clear him until we figure out what's causing the alarm." David stepped forward, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful. "Sir, I have type 1 diabetes and I wear an insulin pump. Here's my medical documentation, and I also have a letter from my doctor explaining the device." He handed over the folder of papers he always carried when traveling. Inside were official letters from his endocrinologist, diagrams of the insulin pump, and even contact information for the device manufacturer's customer service line. Williams flipped through the papers quickly, barely reading them. "These look fine, but policy is policy. If the machine's alarming, we need to do a thorough check." "I understand," David replied, "but my flight board's in 30 minutes. Is there any way we can expedite this?" The supervisor's expression hardened. "Sir, security procedures don't change based on flight schedules. We'll get through this as quickly as possible. But you need to be patient." Behind David, the line of travelers was growing increasingly restless. He could hear fragments of conversations, none of them particularly sympathetic to his situation. "What's taking so long up there? Some people just don't know how to pack properly. I'm going to miss my connection because of this." Williams called over another TSA agent, a younger woman who looked more approachable than the others. "Rodriguez, I need you to do a manual inspection of this gentleman's medical device." Agent Rodriguez approached with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lift your shirt so I can visually inspect the insulin pump." "Is that okay with you?" David felt his face burning with embarrassment. The screening area was in full view of the security line, which now contained at least 50 people. Lifting his shirt would expose not just the medical device but also the insertion site, where the pump connected to his body. "Is there somewhere more private we could do this?" David asked quietly. "This will just take a minute," Rodriguez replied. "The sooner we get this done, the sooner you can catch your flight." David glanced at the departure board again. 28 minutes until takeoff. He had no choice but to comply. He lifted his shirt, revealing the small insulin pump clipped to his belt and the thin tubing that disappeared under his waistband. The device was about the size of a pager, nothing that should cause alarm for experienced security personnel. but Rodriguez seemed uncertain about what she was looking at. She called Supervisor Williams over again. "I can see the device, but I'm not sure if this is what's causing the alarm. The tubing goes under his clothes, and I can't see where it connects." Williams sighed heavily. "Sir, we're going to need you to remove the device completely so we can inspect it properly." David's heart rate spiked. "I can't just remove it. It's connected to my body through a small catheter. Removing it improperly could cause medical complications." "Then we'll need to call for medical assistance," Williams said, already reaching for his radio. "Wait, please," David said, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to stay calm. "I have emergency contact information for my doctor. Could we call him instead of Airport Medical? He knows exactly how this device works." The conversation was attracting more attention now. Other travelers were craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. David could hear someone behind him talking loudly on their phone, explaining to whoever was on the other end that they might miss their flight because of some medical situation at security. Williams shook his head. "Airport protocol requires our medical team to assess any situation involving medical devices. I can't make exceptions." David felt trapped. Every option seemed to lead to more delays and more public attention. His blood sugar was definitely rising now due to stress, and he needed to test it soon. But his testing supplies were still in his carry-on bag, unreachable on the other side of security. "How long will the medical team take to get here?" David asked. "Could be 15 or 20 minutes, Williams replied matter-of-factly. 20 minutes would definitely mean missing his flight. David started calculating alternatives in his head. The next flight to Seattle wasn't until tomorrow morning, which would make him late for the investor meeting. He could try to reschedule, but these investors had specifically arranged their calendars around his presentation. 2 years of work, countless late nights developing his software, all his remaining savings invested in this opportunity. It was all hanging in the balance because of a malfunctioning metal detector. "Sir, is there any way to manually clear me through security?" David asked. "I can provide additional documentation, character references, anything you need." "That's not how this works," Williams said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We have procedures for a reason. If you don't like it, you can file a complaint with customer service after we're done here." The comment stung. David wasn't trying to be difficult or circumvent security measures. He was simply a person with a medical condition trying to catch a flight for the most important meeting of his professional life. Agent Rodriguez seemed to sense David's frustration. "Sir, I know this is inconvenient, but we're just trying to do our jobs. The sooner you cooperate fully, the sooner we can resolve this." "I am cooperating," David replied, his voice sharper than he intended. "I've provided all my medical documentation, I've answered all your questions, and I've been as patient as possible. But my flight leaves in 25 minutes, and this seems like a massive overreaction to a standard medical device." The comment clearly didn't sit well with Supervisor Williams. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice and maintain a respectful tone. Getting agitated isn't going to help your situation." David realized he was losing control of both his emotions and his blood sugar. The stress was affecting his ability to think clearly, and he could feel the familiar symptoms of hyperglycemia beginning to set in. Meanwhile, the line behind him had grown to enormous proportions. Other TSA agents were trying to direct travelers to different checkpoints, but the equipment failures had created a bottleneck throughout the entire security area. David could hear frustrated passengers openly complaining about him now. "This is ridiculous. One person is holding up hundreds of travelers. Why don't they just search him and get it over with? I bet he's making this medical thing up to get special treatment." That last comment hit David like a physical blow. Making it up? He had been managing this chronic condition for over 20 years. He had never asked for special treatment, only basic understanding and accommodation. The departure board updated again. His flight was now listed as final boarding. In the gate area somewhere beyond security, the last passengers were walking down the jetway to his plane. David watched his carefully planned future slip away, one announcement at a time. Tomorrow's investor meeting would happen without him. The funding opportunity he desperately needed would go to someone else. His revolutionary software might never see the light of day, and all because a machine had beeped, and nobody seemed willing or able to apply common sense to resolve a simple misunderstanding. The airport medical team was still nowhere to be seen, and Supervisor Williams showed no signs of flexibility. David was trapped in bureaucratic limbo, watching helplessly as his dreams departed without him. The airport medical team finally arrived 35 minutes later. By then, David's flight had not only departed, but was probably already climbing to cruising altitude somewhere over Colorado. He watched the departure board update one final time, changing his flight status from final boarding to departed. Two medical technicians approached, both looking professional, but slightly confused about why they had been called to a security checkpoint. The older technician, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, introduced herself as Linda. "I understand you have a medical device that's causing some confusion?" she asked David. David nodded, feeling emotionally drained. "It's an insulin pump for diabetes. I've traveled with it hundreds of times without any problems." Linda examined the device and David's medical documentation with the thoroughness that the TSA agents had lacked. Within 5 minutes, she had confirmed that everything was in order and that the pump posed no security risk. "This is a standard continuous glucose monitor and insulin pump system," she explained to Supervisor Williams. "It's FDA approved for air travel and his documentation is complete and current." Williams accepted the medical team's assessment with obvious reluctance. "Fine, clear him through." But the damage was already done. David's flight was gone along with his meeting and potentially his entire future. As he finally walked through the security checkpoint, he felt hollowed out and defeated. The departure terminal seemed different now, filled with people heading to destinations while his own plans lay in ruins. David found a quiet corner near his original gate and sat down heavily in one of the uncomfortable airport chairs. He pulled out his phone and started making the calls he had hoped never to make. First, he contacted the investors in Seattle, explaining that he had missed his flight due to airport security delays. The assistant who answered was polite but firm. The investors had flown in specifically for this meeting and couldn't reschedule. They would be reviewing other proposals instead. Next, David called the airline to see about rebooking. The next available flight to Seattle wasn't until the following afternoon, and it would cost an additional $300 that he couldn't really afford. Even if he took that flight, the investor meeting would be long over. As he sat there replaying the events of the past hour, David felt a mix of emotions washing over him. Frustration at the inflexibility of the security procedures, embarrassment at being singled out and questioned in front of so many people, anger at losing such an important opportunity due to what seemed like a basic misunderstanding. But gradually, another emotion began to emerge, a sense of purpose. David opened his laptop and began typing. What started as an angry email to the airport's customer service department slowly evolved into something more constructive. He found himself documenting not just his own experience, but thinking about the broader implications for other travelers with medical conditions. How many other people had faced similar situations? How many had missed flights, meetings, or important life events because of inadequate training or inflexible procedures? How many had simply accepted the humiliation and inconvenience as an unavoidable part of traveling with a chronic condition? David began researching diabetes advocacy organizations online. He discovered that his experience was far from unique. The American Diabetes Association's website contained dozens of similar stories from travelers who had faced difficulties at airport security checkpoints. Some had been forced to take insulin in public, pathways because agents didn't understand that the medication needed to stay with the passenger. Others had watched helplessly as security personnel damaged expensive medical equipment through improper handling. Many had simply given up on air travel altogether, limiting their personal and professional opportunities. The more David read, the more his perspective shifted. This wasn't just about his missed meeting or his lost opportunity. This was about a systematic problem that affected millions of people with diabetes and other medical conditions. David started drafting a detailed letter, but not the complaint he had originally intended. Instead, he was writing a thoughtful analysis of the problems he had witnessed and concrete suggestions for improvement. He proposed enhanced training programs for TSA agents, focusing on common medical devices and proper procedures for handling them. He suggested clearer signage in airports, explaining passengers' rights when traveling with medical equipment. He outlined a streamlined process for pre-approval of medical devices, similar to the existing pre-check program. As he wrote, David realized he was drawing on his background in software development and user experience design. He was approaching this problem the same way he approached any technical challenge, by identifying the pain points, understanding the user's needs, and designing solutions that would benefit everyone involved. Hours passed as David refined his letter. He researched federal regulations governing airport security and medical accommodations. He looked up contact information for relevant government agencies, advocacy organizations, and industry groups. The departure terminal gradually emptied as evening flights departed and late-night arrivals began. David barely noticed the passage of time. For the first time since the morning's disaster, he felt energized and focused. As he worked, David began to see connections between his experience and his abandoned software project. His accessibility app was designed to help people with disabilities navigate technology more easily. What if the same principles could be applied to help people with medical conditions navigate airport security? He started sketching out ideas for a mobile app that could store and display medical documentation, provide real-time updates on security procedures at different airports, and even allow travelers to pre-register their medical devices with the TSA. The concept excited him in a way that he hadn't felt since the early days of developing his diabetes prediction software. This wasn't just about solving his own problem. It was about solving a problem that affected millions of travelers. David looked up from his laptop and realized that the airport had grown quiet. Most of the shops were closed and only a few scattered passengers remained in the departure area. He checked his phone and was surprised to see that it was nearly 11 o'clock at night. He had been writing and planning for over 6 hours, and his letter had grown into a comprehensive proposal for improving airport security procedures for travelers with medical conditions. What had started as a complaint about missing his flight had evolved into a detailed plan for systemic change. David read through his work one more time, making final edits and adjustments. The document was professional, well-researched, and constructive. It acknowledged the legitimate security concerns that TSA agents faced while proposing practical solutions that would benefit both travelers and security personnel. But as he prepared to save the document, David realized he faced a choice. He could send this letter to the appropriate authorities and hope that someone would pay attention to it. Or he could do something more ambitious. His original business plan was dead. The investors in Seattle had moved on to other opportunities. His savings were nearly exhausted, and he had no immediate prospects for funding his diabetes prediction software. But maybe this was an opportunity in disguise. Maybe the universe was pointing him in a new direction, toward a different kind of problem that needed solving. David closed his laptop and gathered his belongings. He had a long night ahead of him and some important decisions to make. But for the first time since walking through that malfunctioning metal detector, he felt hopeful about the future. His original plans had been derailed, but perhaps he was heading toward something even better. David spent the night in an airport hotel, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind was racing with possibilities and plans. By morning, he had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Instead of flying back home in defeat, David changed his travel plans. He booked a flight to Washington, D.C., where he planned to deliver his proposal directly to the Transportation Security Administration headquarters. During the flight, David refined his letter even further. He realized that sharing his personal story was important, but he needed to back it up with data and research. He spent the 3-hour flight gathering statistics about diabetes prevalence, airport security delays, and passenger complaints related to medical devices. The numbers were staggering. Over 30 million Americans lived with diabetes, and millions more had other conditions requiring medical devices. Yet there was virtually no standardized training for TSA agents on how to handle these situations appropriately. When David landed in D.C., he didn't just send his letter through official channels. He also posted a carefully edited version on LinkedIn, sharing his experience and his proposed solutions with his professional network. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, his post had been shared dozens of times. People began commenting with their own stories of airport security difficulties. A woman named Beth shared how TSA agents had forced her to drink from her son's baby formula to prove it wasn't dangerous, despite having proper documentation. A veteran described having to remove his prosthetic leg in public view because agents weren't trained to handle prosthetics properly. The comments kept coming. Parents of children with epilepsy described having seizure medications confiscated. Cancer patients told stories of having to explain their port catheters to confused security personnel. Each story added weight to David's argument that this wasn't an isolated problem, but a systematic failure affecting thousands of travelers. David's phone started ringing. First, it was a reporter from a travel industry publication who had seen his LinkedIn post, then a blogger who focused on disability rights issues. By evening, he was fielding calls from producers at major news networks. The story was spreading beyond his professional network. Someone had shared his post on Twitter, where it was picked up by patient advocacy groups and frequent travelers. The hashtag #Airport accessibility began trending as more people shared their own experiences. But the response that surprised David most came from within the airline industry itself. A flight attendant reached out to tell him that airline crews often witness these situations, but felt powerless to intervene. A pilot shared that he had personally delayed flights to ensure passengers with medical needs weren't left behind due to security delays. Even some TSA agents began reaching out privately, expressing frustration with inadequate training and unclear policies. One agent wrote that she had always wanted to help passengers with medical devices, but had never received proper guidance on how to do so appropriately and efficiently. Within a week, David's story had been featured in USA Today, CNN, and several airline industry publications. The coverage was universally positive, focusing on his constructive approach and practical solutions rather than just the complaints. The media attention brought unexpected opportunities. The American Diabetes Association invited David to speak at their upcoming conference. A disability rights organization asked him to join their advisory board. Several airports reached out to inquire about consulting services for improving their accessibility procedures. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. David received a call from Dr. Patricia Wilson, a former TSA administrator, who now worked as a consultant on transportation security issues. She had read his proposal and was impressed by both his personal story and his professional recommendations. "I've been working on similar issues for years," Dr. Wilson told him during their first phone conversation. "But I've been approaching it from the inside, trying to change policies through official channels. Your approach, combining personal advocacy with public awareness, is exactly what this issue needs." Dr. Wilson proposed a partnership. She had the connections and institutional knowledge to navigate the bureaucracy, while David had the personal experience and technical skills to develop practical solutions. Together, they could create something that neither could accomplish alone. David flew back to D.C. to meet with Dr. Wilson in person. She was a small woman in her 60s with silver hair and an incredibly sharp mind. Her office was filled with policy documents, research studies, and awards from various transportation and accessibility organizations. "The problem," she explained, "is that the TSA has always focused on security first, with accommodation as an afterthought. But good accessibility actually enhances security by reducing confusion and delays." She showed David internal TSA studies that proved his point. Passengers who faced difficulties at security checkpoints were more likely to become agitated or uncooperative, creating additional security concerns. Meanwhile, well-trained agents who understood medical devices could process these passengers more quickly and efficiently. Dr. Wilson had already drafted preliminary policy recommendations based on David's proposal. She had identified key decision-makers within the TSA and the Department of Homeland Security who would be receptive to their ideas. She even had contacts at major airports who were willing to pilot new training programs. But she needed someone like David, someone with both technical expertise and lived experience, to help develop the actual solutions. Together, they spent 3 days mapping out a comprehensive plan. David would lead the development of new training materials, drawing on his background in user experience design to create programs that were both effective and engaging. Dr. Wilson would handle the political aspects, working with government agencies and industry stakeholders to implement the changes. They also discussed David's idea for a mobile app that could help travelers with medical conditions navigate airport security more easily. Dr. Wilson was enthusiastic about the concept and had ideas for how it could be integrated with existing TSA systems. By the end of their meetings, David had agreed to relocate to Washington, D.C. temporarily to work on the project. Dr. Wilson's consulting firm would provide initial funding, and they would seek additional grants from health advocacy organizations and technology companies. It wasn't the path David had planned when he left for Seattle just 2 weeks earlier. His original software company was effectively on hold and his savings were nearly depleted. But he had never felt more excited about a project in his entire career. As David packed his belongings to move to D.C., he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. A humiliating experience at airport security had somehow transformed into the opportunity of a lifetime. He was about to begin work that could potentially help millions of travelers with medical conditions. The embarrassment and frustration he had felt during those terrible moments at the security checkpoint were being channeled into something positive and meaningful. David's original business plan might have failed, but he was discovering that sometimes the best opportunities come from the most unexpected setbacks. He was no longer just trying to solve his own problems. He was working to solve problems for an entire community of people who had been overlooked for too long. The young man who had missed his flight due to a malfunctioning metal detector was about to become an advocate for systematic change in American airport security. And this was just the beginning. 6 months after that devastating day at Denver International Airport, David found himself in a place he never could have imagined, testifying before a congressional subcommittee on transportation security. The hearing room was intimidating. With its high ceilings and formal atmosphere, representatives sat behind an elevated desk while David sat at a small table facing them, a microphone in front of him and cameras recording every word. But David wasn't nervous. Over the past months, he had told his story dozens of times to reporters, advocacy groups, and government officials. More importantly, he had seen the real impact his work was having on people's lives. "Mr. Chen," said Congressman Thompson, the subcommittee chairman, "can you tell us about the changes that have been implemented since you began this advocacy work?" David smiled, thinking about all the progress they had made. "Thank you, Congressman. I'm pleased to report that we've seen significant improvements in multiple areas." He began with the training programs he had helped develop. Working with Dr. Wilson and a team of medical professionals, they had created comprehensive educational materials for TSA agents. The training covered common medical devices, proper screening procedures, and techniques for communicating respectfully with passengers who had medical conditions. The pilot program had launched at 5 major airports, including Denver International, where David's ordeal had begun. Early results were encouraging. Screening times for passengers with medical devices had decreased by an average of 40%, while passenger complaints had dropped by 70%. More importantly, David continued, we're seeing improved satisfaction on both sides. TSA agents report feeling more confident and prepared when working with passengers who have medical needs, and passengers are experiencing more dignified and efficient screening processes. The mobile app David had envisioned was now a reality. Called MedTravel, it allowed passengers to pre-register their medical devices, receive real-time updates about security procedures at different airports, and access digital copies of all necessary documentation. The app had been downloaded over 200,000 times in its first 3 months. Users could store photos and descriptions of their medical devices, along with doctor's letters and FDA approval documents. When they arrived at security checkpoints, they could simply show the app to TSA agents, who had been trained to recognize and accept the digital documentation. But the technology was only part of the solution. David had also worked with disability rights organizations to establish clearer policies and procedures for medical device screening. Passengers now had the right to request private screening areas for medical devices, and TSA agents were required to explain the screening process before beginning. Perhaps most significantly, David told the subcommittee, we've established a formal feedback system that allows passengers to report problems and suggest improvements. This has created a continuous improvement cycle that benefits everyone involved. The feedback system had already led to several policy changes. For example, passengers with insulin pumps could now request to keep their devices attached during screening, with agents using handheld metal detectors for additional verification when necessary. Representative Martinez, who had diabetes herself, asked David about the broader impact of his work. "The changes we've implemented go beyond just airport security," David replied. "We've created a model for how institutions can better accommodate people with medical conditions without compromising safety or efficiency." Indeed, the success of the TSA program had attracted attention from other organizations. Hospitals were adapting the training materials for their security staff. Concert venues and sports stadiums were implementing similar procedures for fans with medical devices. Even schools were using modified versions of the training to help teachers better understand students with chronic conditions. David's nonprofit organization, which he had founded with Dr. Wilson, was now working on multiple projects. They were developing training programs for international airports, creating educational materials for newly diagnosed patients about traveling with medical devices, and lobbying for federal legislation to standardize accessibility procedures across all modes of transportation. The personal impact on David's life had been equally dramatic. He had become a recognized expert on accessibility and transportation policy, speaking at conferences around the world. Major technology companies were consulting with him on designing more inclusive products. He had even been invited to join the advisory board of a large diabetes research foundation, but perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the people whose lives had been directly improved by his work. Received dozens of emails and letters from travelers, sharing their positive experiences with the new procedures. A mother wrote to thank him for making it possible for her diabetic teenager to travel to college without fear or embarrassment. A business executive described how the new policies had allowed him to resume traveling for work after years of avoiding air travel due to anxiety about security screening. One letter particularly moved David. It came from Elena, a young woman with an insulin pump who had been inspired by his story to pursue her own advocacy work. She was now working to improve accessibility in public transportation systems in her home state. "Your courage to speak up about your experience gave me the courage to speak up about mine," she wrote. "You showed me that one person's voice really can make a difference." As David concluded his testimony before the congressional subcommittee, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The humiliation and frustration he had experienced at Denver International Airport had been transformed into purpose and impact. In closing, David said to the representatives, "I want to emphasize that this work isn't finished. We've made significant progress, but there are still millions of Americans with medical conditions who face unnecessary barriers when they travel. Our goal is to ensure that having a chronic illness or disability doesn't limit anyone's ability to pursue their dreams. Whether that's a business opportunity, a family vacation, or simply the freedom to move through the world with dignity." The subcommittee voted unanimously to support federal legislation incorporating David's recommendations. The bill would mandate standardized training for all TSA personnel and establish national guidelines for screening passengers with medical devices. After the hearing, David walked out of the Capitol building into the bright Washington sunshine. His phone was buzzing with congratulatory messages from colleagues and advocates around the country. Dr. Wilson, who had been in the audience during his testimony, joined him on the steps of the Capitol. "You know," she said, "when I first read your LinkedIn post 6 months ago, I thought you had potential. But I never imagined we'd accomplish this much this quickly." David smiled, thinking about how different his life looked now compared to that terrible morning in Denver. He had lost an important business opportunity, but he had gained something much more valuable: the knowledge that he could use his experience to help others. His original software company remained on hold, but David was no longer concerned about that. The work he was doing now felt more important and more fulfilling than any business venture he had previously imagined. That evening, David flew back to Denver for a special event at the airport where his journey had begun. The airport was hosting a ceremony to announce their permanent adoption of the new accessibility procedures, and David had been invited as the guest of honor. As he walked through the same security checkpoint where he had been humiliated 6 months earlier, David was greeted by Supervisor Williams, the same TSA agent who had overseen his screening that day. "Mr. Chen," Williams said, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology, and I want you to know that the training you helped develop has made my job much easier and more rewarding. Thank you for turning a negative experience into something positive for all of us." David shook his hand warmly. There were no hard feelings. Williams and his colleagues had been doing their jobs as they understood them at the time. The real problem had been systemic, and David was proud that they had worked together to fix it. As David boarded his flight home that night, he passed through security without incident. His insulin pump was quickly and respectfully screened by a well-trained agent, who understood exactly what she was looking at. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. But more importantly, David noticed other passengers with medical devices being treated with the same dignity and efficiency. An elderly man with a pacemaker, a young woman with a continuous glucose monitor, a veteran with a prosthetic limb, all were screened quickly and respectfully by agents who knew how to handle their situations appropriately. David settled into his seat and opened his laptop to work on his next project, expanding the accessibility training program to international airports. It was ambitious work that would require years of effort and collaboration with governments around the world. But David had learned something important about himself during this journey. He thrived when working on problems that mattered to real people. The technical challenges were engaging, but it was the human impact that truly motivated him. As his plane lifted off from Denver, David looked down at the airport where his life had been forever changed. What had started as the worst day of his professional life had become the beginning of the most meaningful work he had ever done. Sometimes, David reflected, the universe has to break your plans completely before it can show you what you're really meant to do. His humiliation at airport security had seemed like a disaster at the time, but it had actually been the first step toward finding his true purpose. The young man who had missed his flight due to bureaucratic inflexibility had become a catalyst for systematic change that would benefit millions of travelers for years to come, and he was just getting started.